you, Lynn. Thank you. Lynn, thank you for that most generous introduction. Franklin Roosevelt never spent a day in uniform in his entire life. He, prior to becoming president, however, even before he was stricken by polio, he had a strong interest in military matters. As a kid, he had hoped that he would be able to attend the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, but his doting mother couldn't bear the thought of long separation from her only child. In 1912, President Woodrow Wilson named FDR as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which fulfilled simultaneously two roles that meant a great deal to him. It expressed his love of the sea and his continuing interest in military matters. Now, in 1917, the United States goes to war. FDR goes to see Woodrow Wilson and tells him he wants to resign his post and he wants to be in uniform. Wilson said, "No, you're doing an important job where you are." Nevertheless, by 1918, when the United States is deeply involved in World War I, he's determined to get to the Western Front. And against the resistance of his boss, the Navy Secretary, Josephus Daniels, he manages to get to France. And there, he adopts a vaguely military-looking uniform of his own devising. He wears khaki pants tucked into leather puttees, has a long military-looking jacket. He wears a French Army helmet, and he has a gas mask strung around his neck. By the time World War II breaks out, that is in September of 1939, Roosevelt is commander-in-chief of an army that ranks somewhere between Portugal and Bulgaria. He is commander-in-chief of an army that trains with trucks marked tank and whose soldiers train with hand grenades substituted by eggs. By the time the war has been underway for a number of months, Britain is pretty much with its back to the wall. The Low Countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and as well as France, Denmark, Norway, have been conquered by the Germans, and the invasion of Britain seems imminent. Roosevelt is determined to try to do something to help the British. On his own hook, he comes up with a plan to give the British 50 old American destroyers. In return, the British will give us a number of Atlantic military bases. The bases are of no great value to us, but they justify our giving Navy warships to the British. British fortunes continue rather unfortunate. By the end of 1940, in December of 1940, Churchill tells FDR very frankly, "My country is broke." And so Roosevelt again tries to think of what he can do to bolster the British. He is out on the cruiser Tuscaloosa on presumably a recreational voyage where he's sunning himself and he's playing cards and he's watching old movies. But in the meantime, he is hatching an idea. When he's back in Washington at a press conference, he makes this analogy. He said, "Now, if your neighbor's house is on fire," meaning, of course, Britain, "you don't offer to sell him your garden hose. You offer to loan him your garden hose." Thus was born the concept of Lend-Lease, through which the United States, before going into the war itself, began providing tens of millions of dollars of arms so that the British could stay in the game. Much to his delight, when the Brits sent their first shopping list under Lend-Lease to the United States, they asked for 900,000 feet of hose. In the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler invades the Soviet Union, and Roosevelt now stretches Lend-Lease to include the Russians as well. At about that time, he calls in his Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, and he asks for an atlas. An atlas is brought to FDR's desk. He takes a pencil and he runs it down the middle of the Atlantic between the bulge of Brazil and the bulge of West Africa. And he declares that everything to the west of that line is part of the Western Hemisphere, an expansion of the hemisphere that would have probably shocked President James Madison, who came up with the Monroe Doctrine. Indeed, under FDR's interpretation, Iceland and Greenland, which are 2,000 miles from the American coast, are now part of the Western Hemisphere as much as Boston or Rio de Janeiro. And he then determines that these seas have to be defended. And again, he goes before the press and he says, if a rattlesnake is poised to strike you, you don't wait until it strikes, you crush it beforehand. What he means in effect is that American warships will go after German vessels who are in these waters that he's now declared the part of the Western Hemisphere. This becomes known as the shoot-on-sight policy. And what he's done, he has declared an undeclared war against Germany on the high seas of the Atlantic. By the time that Pearl Harbor occurs in December of 1941, Roosevelt has seized the levers of control of the American military as no president since Abraham Lincoln in the Civil War. He revels in this role. He's as comfortable with it as the old beat-up fedora that he used to wear as his trademark hat. At one point, he is to be introduced at an event by the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull. He tells Hull, don't introduce me as president today. Introduce me as commander-in-chief. In this role, he assumed three major positions. First of all, as recruiter-in-chief, finding the people who could lead the armed forces and win a war. The second role he assumed was as strategist-in-chief, how to fight that war. The third was as the morale officer, in effect, mobilizing morale in the United States to keep Americans supporting that war until its successful conclusion. In his first role as recruiter-in-chief, he proved a pretty good judge of horseflesh. One of his major appointments to run the Army was General George C. Marshall. Marshall found out very early what it was like to deal with Roosevelt, a very dominant personality. He had been warned about how to handle FDR, but in an early cabinet meeting where Roosevelt presented a plan for enlarging the nascent Air Force at that period, Marshall thought he was going a little too quickly, and he stood up to Roosevelt and said, no, that's not the way to go. Now, Marshall's comrades in arms warned him that this is a good way to get yourself assigned to a position in Guam. But FDR regarded yes men as a dime a dozen. And he was very impressed by the way that General Marshall stood up to him. General Marshall, in effect, becomes Roosevelt's stout oak through to the end of the war. Now, let me mention one other point about Marshall, because Roosevelt had a conviction that he could seduce anybody with his charm. So in the early days when he's dealing with George Marshall, he starts addressing him as George. The displeasure is evident on Marshall's face. And thereafter, throughout their association. He's general marshal.